Rand Paul is a very bad person. Okay, let's just start with this, right? But the fact that he is speaking, honestly, with more clarity on what's happening in Gaza right now than any Democratic senator outside of Dick Durbin.
Durbin now.
Thankfully, the number 2 Democrat in the Senate came out and said, I support a ceasefire this morning. But
did Rand Paul get asked about a ceasefire in this?
I am not exactly sure.
I'm curious about that.
I would be curious about it too. But this is a complete abdication, honestly, of duty by the Democratic Party, that this kind of rhetoric isn't more prominent, because Rand Paul is a libertarian who wants to cut back into the federal government's budget in order to harm people here with austerity. So let's not make a mistake and think that he's some sort of peace fighter. But listen to his rhetoric here.
And just to state where he is with regards to the Senate, every lawmaker in the Senate except for Republican Rand Paul has signed on to a resolution expressing support for Israel in the face of the Hamas onslaught. And I don't think it's because Rand Paul likes Hamas.
Yes, but he is, because he's not, checking in with certain interest groups and saying, can I say ceasefire or humanitarian pause? Or do I have to mention human shields in my statement, Elizabeth Warren, when I'm condemning the bombing of a refugee camp? Because he's not being like clammy-handed in responding to this and just acknowledging what he sees, he's able to have a common sense reaction, even though, again, I oppose essentially everything that Rand Paul stands for.
And speaking of war, I wanted to ask you one question about the war that's going on in Gaza right now. A couple of days after October 7th, you were on Fox News and you said, let's let Israel do what they need to do, which is to have a punishing response to the people in Gaza, to say, no more. We are not going to let this happen. We've now seen what that punishing response has been, minimum of 8,000 plus casualties. We've seen what appear to amount to war crimes from Israel Defense Forces targeting entire apartment buildings, entire blocks. Do you stand by that original claim, and what do you feel like should be done now? Should there be a ceasefire at this point?
I think when you see the horrific images of young people being mowed down with automatic weapons at a concert, images of whole families being killed, it's hard not to, be moved by that and understand Israel's desire to want to respond and to try to wipe out particularly the military leadership of this. But you're right, they're embedded in a civilian population, and many civilians have died. And this is ultimately a judgment that Israel will have to make, whether or not the disruption of Hamas chain of command is now sufficient, or whether they go on. Because you are right, as more civilians die in Gaza, not intentionally, but as they die in Gaza, there's always the question, are 10 new terrorists created for every civilian that was killed? The same can be said of the drone attacks throughout Africa, the drone attacks that killed a humanitarian worker after our soldiers died in Afghanistan as we were leaving. So there always is the question of blowback. And ultimately, that decision has to be made by Israel. And I think that the reporting on it will make a big difference. There was a great article recently talking about this by Bonnie Christian that was in Reason magazine. And the way she ended her article to me was just amazing, almost poetic, or from a novel, talking about how that we descend into moral chaos if we let ourselves be consumed by revenge, either revenge of Palestinians, civilians that were innocently killed, or Israeli citizens that were innocently killed. If we let ourselves, we'll descend into sort of a moral chaos that really is ever escalating and never ending. And so there has to come a time when we do talk about how do you make things better in Gaza. But I'll tell you, it's hard to, in the midst of the death and carnage. I was there in 2013 and spoke with Netanyahu about trying to facilitate and allow Gaza to open their own port. And I said, maybe you do it like they did the Panama Canal for so many years, with joint security by Israel and Gaza, but allow them to collect their own duties and allow them to have some income coming in through a port. And his response to me, and this wasn't after a massacre, this was in more of a relative time of peace, he says they have a port in Israel. And that kind of thinking won't get to a point where we can have a peaceful arrangement. But on the other side, I mean, if they
All right. Well, yeah, a bit of word salad there. And again, Rand Paul's ideology is not going to get him to the right conclusion, most likely, in any kind of situation. But that is just the truth about what more violence does. It radicalizes people more. Israel has really two choices if they are saying that this is an effort to protect other Israelis from future terror attacks. They can either call a ceasefire and start peace negotiations and begin some sort of reconciliation for the crimes on both sides.
Yeah.
In this instance, I mean, again, the apartheid is the rolling systemic crime, of course, and the occupation, but the crimes on both sides, and do some sort of reconciliation council and bring Palestinian voices to the table, facilitated by international coalitions, and begin to heal these wounds. Or they can do what they're doing now, which is seemingly try to ensure the security of Israelis by making sure that no one is left. By making sure that no one is left to be angry and furious and radicalized.
One thing we left unaddressed from the Tim Pool clip was that guy saying there was a ceasefire before October 7th. And that is a pernicious little way of telling the recent history of this. That ignores everything. Like, I mean, what we have been seeing in the lead up to all of this, like the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque by Jewish settlers, like literally taking people's homes. Like, that is provocation, and we need to be able to say it's provocation, and innocent people are not valid targets for responding to provocations like that, and we can be clear about that. But the idea that we're going to erase what is happening that sets the context for this is how and instead just bomb. Instead just bomb it away. I'm sorry, like you are creating terror, and Bibi Netanyahu knows that when you triple tap a fucking refugee camp, that it's not going to pacify the population.
That is why Netanyahu was quoted multiple times, or at least, I have the quote under this piece of paper here, but in 2019 in Haaretz, it was reported in the Likud meeting, he spoke about how bolstering Hamas is essential.
Part of their policy.
Part of their policy, and how, it's been known that he's allowed Qatari money to go towards Hamas.
It's colonial manipulation.
Yeah, in order to continuously have Hamas be that threat where you can also tie all Palestinians to Hamas. Brandon, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something earlier.
No, I was just going to say, Rand Paul is also a good example of how Rand Paul is no great person, but if there's one thing that he probably does more align with is this idea of isolationism that would probably include drastically reducing our funding for Israel and to Israel. And, that's one reason why Israel is very concerned with public opinion on this issue and controlling the narrative on this issue, because at the end of the day, maybe not as a direct result, maybe as part of a direct result of this, but maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but it's very easy to see how these actions could radicalize an American population to be more amenable to reducing the amount of support that Israel as a nation, both militarily and financially, gets from the United States of America, especially as our own country becomes more and more it slips more and more into a recession, slips more and more into maldistribution of resources, and people, start reviewing how we are spending this money. And, that's something that the Israeli state cannot necessarily afford to have happen, for them to receive less funding, in the billions from the United States of America in order to not just perpetuate this war, but to, allow their entire society to function at the level it's functioning at right now.
Yeah. I mean, and I think I think like one thing that's been clear in through this is that the squad sort of adjacent stuff is really the only group that's willing to be that courageous on that. Nonetheless, I think AOC needs to move to no Iron Dome funding unless we move on these actual issues, these fundamental issues. I find it so disgusting that for this government, the one that we're seeing lie and bomb hospitals in front of our eyes, we are basically like giving them impunity, technologically speaking. That should come with a price. That should come with a massive price. And I'm not saying withdraw it, but I'm saying my personal thing would be one state, democratic rights for everybody, including right of return. And, if we, to make sure you feel okay about that, we can keep the Iron Dome stocked. But Iron Dome for an apartheid state that's actively settling and ethnic cleansing a population is disgusting. It's disgusting.
Well, I mean, it's the material manifestation of, like, again, the asymmetry of imperialist warfare to believe that, like, you, and America's guilty of this too, that you can establish a war zone in another country and then dictate that that war zone that you've established in another country or in another population's land is, you know, disqualifying of anybody who lives there to be civilians, disqualifying of anybody who exists there to have a expectation of safety, while still establishing that, well, like, your population deserves to be safe. It's, you know, they say that Israel and Gaza is at war, and therefore Gaza, there are no civilians in Gaza, but you're not allowed to turn that logic around. Like, okay, then does that mean there are no civilians in Israel? Like, if you're at war, if this is not a campaign of ethnic cleansing, does that mean that you're ceding, you know, the logic that your society does no longer has the right of expectation of guaranteed safety for your civilians? And they wouldn't concede that, but that no one is making that argument, because obviously no one wants civilians to die on either side. But it's this general expectation that you can, you know, you can perpetuate a narrative that the place you've created a war zone in disallows for civilians, that I think is, you know, just atrocious, while still going like, oh, but no, our population deserves to be safe. Our population deserves to not have to live in fear. Right. But we're at war, and they can't expect that.
You want a technology that keeps your population impugned from you attacking other civilian populations. You can fund that shit yourself.
100%.
Using SodaStream money.
Oh my God. Yes. That's one. Do not buy SodaStream. Don't buy Sabra. There's some other ones.
I did see something. Yeah, the I guess BDS does have. I saw somebody talking about this. It's not just like any Israeli product. Although, like, I'm not going to stop you. But BDS says, you know, we try to keep it to these specific companies, including
SodaStream.
SodaStream, and it was definitely on there to make the impacts of BDS more sort of noticeable. And also, Bernie Sanders should revise his position on BDS.
I'm allergic to hummus, so I always boycott Sabra.
Good for you. No, you should just make it a principled stance. Don't reveal that. All right, there you go.
Too late.
Chickpeas in general, or just hummus?
Garbanzo beans, chickpeas, and how could it be? How could it be? What else in hummus would I be allergic to?
I don't. That's a dumb question.
I just want to say, as the far and away soda aficionado in this room right now, there has never been a soda stream that I've tasted that was anywhere near as good as legit real soda companies. So stick with drinking your whatever you drink, whatever your soda of choice is. You don't need soda stream.
Yeah,
that's just soda stream's like like a bougie, like, I have too much counter space appliance. Like, oh, look at all of the appliances I can fit on this, like, huge island.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say, I don't have a soda stream. I tried someone else's. Just want to get that out there.